AC and efforts. It's the Atavistian time of the month, so, some spoilers ahead, I think, in this garage jam session.
I don't know. I mean, I'm never happy with what I write, so I would have, there would definitely be something I didn't like about it and thought I'd done wrong, and that's the main thing that I think maybe I did wrong.
AC and efforts at CNF Pod, the creative nonfiction podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara. We've got Lily Hyde, born in the UK, living in Ukraine. She's a journalist and author of the novel Dreamland, and her piece for The Atavist is titled 2,000 Miles from Home. As Russia invaded Ukraine, 3 women from the same family became pregnant at the same time. Then the war tore them apart. I dare you not to read it after reading that head and subhead. We dig into how she connected with Ukraine, how she got access to this family she writes about, the one regret she had about the writing of the piece, and the ethics of writing about people's lives when it feels like it's none of our fucking business. I feel this more and more day to day, like, who the fuck am I to invade your life and write about it? And when I'm making decisions about what gets put into print or whatever, I feel ickier and ickier about being a journalist almost every day and want to disappear from the face of the earth. But before we hear from Lily, we hang out with Jonah Ogles, the lead editor of this piece, to talk about some of the unique challenges this story presented. Like, why bother wasting time anymore on the housekeeping bullshit? You know what I mean? You know what I mean. Here's Jonah. Riff. I think it was Rilke who, he wrote something like, letters to a young writer or something to that extent. And, a lot of times, even on this podcast, we're always like trying to give advice to, or just, pointers or little things to make writing better. But I want to flip that on its head a little bit because, you're on the editor side of the table. And like, if you had to write something of like letters to a young editor, what might you say to a young editor, who, just to work on that side of the craft?
And it's tough because, I mean, there are a couple of ways to answer that. I feel like the thing that's giving me pause is that I think it's very rare for editors to be in a position where they have a ton of time to actually edit, because of the state of the business these days. So that makes it more difficult because the short answer is just spend time with the story, sort of move through it as slowly as you can or as you need to. Printing stories out, which I don't do a ton anymore, but printing stories out is a nice way of slowing down. I think I've talked before on this podcast about Alex Hurd's advice. He's an editor at Outside now, and he always, when I was having trouble with a story, he would have me sit down and just write like 1-sentence summaries of each section to see how a story is unfolding, what flows to the next thing, and making sure that there's sort of a logic and a natural progression to the way a story is structured. I mean, the thing that it took me a while to figure out was that like I needed to just trust my gut. Like if which doesn't mean that like I always know the answer, but I'm at this point at least an experienced reader, if not a good reader, and if something is not working, or if I feel like something isn't working or that we're moving too fast or too slow here, that's probably right. And I think or at least when I was a young editor, I was working with far more experienced writers, and I was worried that like, oh God, they're going to think I'm stupid or that I don't know what I'm doing, which of course, like that happens, like that's fine. There's nothing to worry about. But I sort of pulled my punches, so to speak, because I wanted to just kind of like keep the writer happy and tell them they were doing a great job. And that's not always in service of the story. Certainly tell writers when you think something is really working. They love to hear that. But just listening to my own gut tell me this is right, this isn't, and then opening a conversation with the writer to figure out why it isn't working.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the key part. But as you've mentioned before, given that editors are just flooded with so much stuff, they can barely do more than copy edit half the time. So there's often no time to have those conversations. But that's where you're in the fortunate position of often having a lot of runway between publication and drafting of pieces where you can have that dialogue with people, where you might even be able to say, how about you experiment with this, try it on for size. If not, we can go into the back room and get you a new pair of shoes. It's like, try this on, see what works, and then we'll work. It's that dialogue that you always talk about.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the strategy I had when I was at Outside and found myself with less and less time to devote to features, I mean, the deal I kind of had to make with myself was that short pieces, I was going to be a copy editor for them. I was going to try to, like, especially like the online stuff, news stories, the smaller service pieces, like, you want it to be a functional story. You don't want readers to be lost in it. But beyond
the narrative arc of this review of ski boots, I don't know what's going on here.
Yeah, exactly. You just had to deal with that stuff as quickly as you can, and then you try to carve out the space to still give those features sort of the attention that they deserve, and spend a little bit more time on them. And I think that's why, I mean, you hear book editors talk about this, like, they don't edit at work. They edit at home or on the train, or whatever works for them, but it's outside of normal business hours. And I think for magazine editors today, you probably have to think about doing stuff like that. And there are times, even like with my much more relaxed publishing schedule, where I'm still aware that, like, a day will be particularly busy with kind of admin type stuff, and I need to wake up early to give an hour to the story, or do it just before I go to bed. Just like finding that little space to be able to edit the story when you're not thinking like, okay, I have a meeting in 15 minutes, I'm just going to get through like one section of this, like that's where the editing process starts to suffer a little bit.
And so now with Lily's piece that takes place in Ukraine during this, during this war, there's it's a riveting piece, and it's just wild on its surface of just what these central figures are going through and bringing into this world. So maybe talk a little bit about just what struck you about this piece.
Yeah, I mean, this was a story that, like, as soon as I read the pitch, I wanted to work on it. It was just a really powerful human story, that is set in this, like, incredibly important sort of like geopolitical moment or setting. And it's rare to sort of have both of those things in a pitch that we get. And so I wanted to work on it, yeah, just right away, and be involved in it, because it felt really important and really powerful. And Lily is just like she's a knockout writer. She's really good. She really cares. She's got a lot of experience in this part of the world, and is really attentive to words and sentences and structure and all of that. So it was a really good experience for me, because I went from like working at Outside to working at the Atavist, and so I edit what I think of as like kind of like normal features, but I don't do a ton of like newsy features, and certainly like very little war editing of any story about war, geopolitics. So there were things I learned from in the process. Like I was sort of editing it for pace and trying to keep the story moving. And one of the more frequent notes Lily would send me was like, "Hey, I want this paragraph in because it shows how sort of disorienting the life is in the middle of this conflict." And that's not something I necessarily always have to think about in other stories. So it was a good lesson for me in like, okay, we can tell the story faster, but maybe it's good to slow down in certain moments and really let some of that like nuance and complexity really sink in for readers.
And what struck me about the piece too that I wanted to ask you about is, given that are young, there are babies that are brought into this conflict across generations and family and borders, and you're a dad of young kids, and I wanted to kind of get your sense of how this piece resonated with you, given that you're the father of two young kids.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, man. I mean, there have been multiple times editing this story where I've just kind of like sat back and had a good like 5 second cry,
Yeah.
um, because uh, I mean, this is the power of storytelling, right? You arouse empathy in the reader, and you get them to imagine. You want to tell it in such a vivid and descriptive way that you get them in that space. I don't think that's necessarily even possible for me to imagine quite what it's like to be in the situation they're in. But the glimpse of it that I can summon is terrifying. And, I don't, I'm in awe of sort of their strength and sort of their resilience, their ability to still function and love and be devoted parents and children, because I have a hard enough time when we have like a bunch of appointments and
Mm-hmm.
kind of a chaotic day. I get all kinds of grumpy. But here are these families faced with much more catastrophic potential consequences, still finding a way to sort of to love each other. And that it's really kind of heartbreaking and powerful.
Yeah, and what you said a moment ago about arousing empathy in the reader, I think that's a really good way of not categorizing, but like as a writer myself, sometimes I wonder like what's the utility in probing into people's private lives and telling these stories, which seems like for mainly the gain of the writer and their own prestige and their own career, and like doesn't it seem, I don't know, just it doesn't it seem rude to be probing
Yeah.
in that way? But that's kind of what journalism and narrative journalism and stories of this nature do. They illuminate things, and I think you said it very well in that when these stories are done well with the right degree of focus, they arouse empathy and shine lights into corners that otherwise might not get them. And maybe that's a way to get out of your own head when you feel like, oh, what business do I have to be probing into these people's lives?
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, it's something I've wrestled with kind of throughout my journalistic career.
Yeah.
That like, yeah, it's a little voyeuristic. It sometimes feels exploitative, um, and you try if it's blatantly that. You should take a look at whether or not it's a story you want to tell. But I hope, and I think this story is a perfect example of this. It, they're like you were saying, you tell it because it's going to help people understand something in a deeper and more profound way, and you hope that that results in like, I don't know, maybe it's too grand to say like a better citizenry, but but you hope that your readers are processing this and walking away changed in the for the better in some way. I think you've got to hope for that as a journalist. Otherwise, otherwise it is just exploitative. But I think when it's done well, and I think Lily's story is an example of this. It's more powerful because it is true. Because you're seeing the real life consequences of a series of decisions or actions, um, and that even in remarkable pieces of fiction, they don't have that. They have that same emotional power, but I feel like it's missing something that true stories have still.
Yeah, and I think as we kind of like wind down here, but about her piece, what I get the sense too, and this doesn't happen too frequently, at least what I've read with various Atavist stories over the last few years. It's like it ends, but it doesn't feel like an ending.
Mm-hmm.
It, because at the very, not to give too much away at the point, well, I always do a spoiler alert thing. It's just, but like it ends with, with the young man like basically enlisting, and like so
Yeah.
it's gonna go on. It carries on.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, this is one of those stories where like the ending, it's not tidy, and it can't be, because of just kind of the war is ongoing. These people's lives are ongoing, but it's a lot of stories I edit, and I'm just kind of like, oh, okay, like this is a solid story, and this was one where like you keep reading news about Ukraine, and like uh, this town where much of the story takes place, was bombed recently, and while we were in the production cycle for this story, and like the hotel where Lily had stayed at was hit. And like I've worried about Maxim and Lara, the characters who have moved to that town, and it's you're right, it's very much an ongoing story. It's kind of like the end of a chapter, but there's still, these people are still in it, they're still living it, and which is a maybe it gives the story more power, maybe it makes it more important, I don't know, but it certainly gives me kind of an uneasy feeling to know that it's, we've just told one part of their story, and they have this whole thing ahead of them.
Well, awesome, Jonah. This is great as always. So thanks for carving out the time to kind of tease out this piece and dig into some of the nitty gritty of what it means to be on your side of the table.
Yeah, my pleasure. Always really fun to catch up and talk about stories.
All right. Now, Lily is practically and enviably, mind you, invisible online, like she's a ghost. The tag of her email is lilyhyde.com, and that doesn't work. You type that in and it says, this page isn't working. Lilyhyde.com is currently unable to handle this request, and I love her for it. But, like all of us, she has an antiquated LinkedIn page. Gotcha. And it says, author, journalist, editor, and researcher specializing in Ukraine and Crimea. She's worked in and written about the fields of human rights, public health, particularly HIV and AIDS, migration, and climate change. Her book, Dreamland, published by Walker in 2008, endorsed by Amnesty International, is the only existing novel about the return of the Crimean Tatars to their homeland in the 1990s. I like that she's a ghost. And I think I want to be a ghost too. Here's Lily. Huh. Very nice. And so, I understand that, you've actually, you've written a couple novels. One is Dreamland, one girl's struggle to find her true home. And I wonder where the inspiration for that came from.
So Dreamland, it's a novel, but it's very, very closely based on real events, and it's about the Crimean Tatars, who are the indigenous people from Crimea. and their entire ethnic group was deported in 1944 on Stalin's orders. The excuse was that they'd collaborated with the Nazis on the German occupation, and they were not allowed to return home for 50 years. They eventually came home when the Soviet Union collapsed. And it's a retelling about a family that come back in the 1990s. So it tells the whole story of their deportation and what led up to that, the Second World War, and about coming back. So this was just after Ukraine had become independent. So coming back to this completely new country and rebuilding their lives from scratch. And I was actually commissioned to write it. Publisher Walker, they were producing this series of novels which were endorsed by Amnesty International. So they had to have some kind of sort of human rights element. And I'd done quite a lot of journalism about the Crimean Tatars, and found it this really amazing story, which at that time really nobody knew about. And so when the editor at Walker asked me if I would like to write something for this series, I was like, aha, finally, I can write about the Crimean Tatars. So that's how that happened.
Very nice. And do you find yourself more drawn to writing fiction or nonfiction?
Good question. That's something I'm really, really thinking about at the moment, as I think a lot of people are, a lot of writers, a lot of journalists. The world seems so hard to put into fiction in a way. I think we're very concerned with authenticity now, it seems to me, with who is entitled to speak on a particular subject, whether we can trust that person, whether we can trust journalism, whether we can trust photography. And it seems to me there's a kind of distrust of literature, and whether it can really tell us anything or whether it's just irrelevant to real life, or a kind of division between you read fiction to escape and you read non-fiction to engage with what's really happening. It seems to me that these are kind of debates which are really very current at the moment. Sorry, that was a bit of a long digression, but
No, I love that. And you bring up a really good point about like trusting journalism and trusting photography. And I was thinking about this just this past weekend. It was just on TV, and I think the new a new Google phone is touting that, like, it's just like you take a picture and there's this one picture of a guy he's throwing his baby up in the air, and he's throwing it up like a foot in the air, like you normally would. But when they edit on the commercial, they edit this picture and they put the baby like 5 feet in the air. And it looks natural, and like they're advertising like look at this, you can just embellish this photograph, but it's a total fallacy. And it's like, okay, well, that's something you can do in the palm of your hand, but like, what if that is in the hands of, I don't know, bad actors who want to fudge things or maybe clean things up in a way that scrubs out the reality of what's going on? It's like, it's pretty dangerous what's going out there. And how do you trust anything that you're seeing anymore?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, artificial intelligence, I think it's absolutely terrifying from those terms. I mean, I think bad actors is one whole incredibly important issue, but just generally the fact that actually anybody can manipulate anything now. You learn the language of whichever AI system you're using, and you can get it to draw whatever you want, and it looks really convincing.
Yeah, and it's just like, all right, how do you navigate that now? And even in the writing that I'm doing, and even let's just say even in podcasting or whatever, it's like I start to think now, like, well, if I have to do it in such a way, like if it sounds like AI could do it, then I have to push myself into not like more extreme, but I have to be as individualistic as possible. And I wonder if, maybe you're starting to metabolize it in that way too. Like, if AI could do this, then I need to push myself into more creative liberties and even creative risks in the work you do.
Yeah, I was talking to my brother about this. He's a composer. Um, was talking to him about this a couple of days ago. We were saying exactly this, that maybe people are going to start much more valuing things which are obviously homemade or obviously individual, so less polished, more kind of like, I don't know, punk zines or something, you know.
Yeah.
We're going to turn our backs on, especially in photography, we're going to turn our backs on this really glossy aesthetic kind of photography, which I think is way overdue. I mean, when I look at war photography now, I hate it. There's this aesthetic of war photography, you know, this really saturated grey colour, and it just makes everything look fake to me.
And on your LinkedIn profile, it says, author, journalist, editor, and researcher specializing in Ukraine, Crimea, and the former Soviet Union. So I have to ask how you got involved in that area of study.
Well, first of all, I'm a bit horrified you looked at my LinkedIn profile because I haven't updated it for about the last 5 years.
You're very hard to find online. Like I couldn't find much.
No, I don't really like having an online presence. And yes, I would change that former Soviet Union for a start, because I think these days to lump those countries together into something they were 30 years ago is not really correct. But I got into it completely by accident. I wanted to live abroad and travel abroad. I went to the Czech Republic and got a job teaching English. And it just happened that my students were Ukrainians. And honestly speaking, I'd never even heard of Ukraine before. I mean, this was in the 90s, so I guess I have kind of an excuse. And they got me interested in Ukraine. I was offered a job in Ukraine. And yeah, I got a job contract for, I think it was for 6 weeks. And that was 20 years ago.
Tell us how you arrived at the story and found the people who are central to this story.
I found them. It was sort of by accident. So the family come from this village, Rydkodob, which is very close to the Russian border in East Ukraine, which was occupied when the war started when the Russian invasion started in 2022, and it was liberated in autumn. And at the end of last year, I was traveling with a health project of mobile clinics. So these vans which were going to frontline territories and liberated territories to bring healthcare to these places, because nothing was working, no hospitals, no clinics, no doctors, no pharmacies, nothing. So we were traveling to these villages with a small team of doctors and nurses, and also bringing some humanitarian aid. And I was just talking to people in this village, Rydkodob. The morning we went, the kindergarten had been bombed and hit, and everybody was somewhat upset about that. But they told me that there was not just one but two newborn babies in this village, where there was no electricity, no gas, no water, no nothing. And I was just, how? And then it turned out these two babies were in the same family, but two generations of the same family. And then it turned out that the younger couple with this baby had to do this gigantic journey all the way through Russia to get back, and they'd come back like a week before I arrived. And I met Maxime, the young father, on that first visit. And yeah, it just seemed to me such an amazing story. And then I actually went back a few weeks later and met the rest of the family. And then I had this story and was thinking, what on earth do I do with this? It's way too big for just a usual feature. And so I sort of sat on it for a couple of months thinking, how on earth do I tell this and do it justice? And then, I started pitching it around, and I'm really, really happy that Atavist took it, because I really don't know where else I could have published what seems to me such a big and complex story. And it was great to have the space to get into the whole sort of complications of what it's like living under occupation, how you can get out from this situation, and the sort of complexities of what turned out to be the complexities in this family, with the third baby, and the mother who turned out to be, I don't want to say pro-Russian, but anyway, there was conflict within the family as well about what side they were on in the war.
And trust is always hard to. It's always one of the central challenges for any journalist, especially telling stories that are super intimate in nature. So for you, how did you ingratiate and earn the trust of your central figures?
I mean, I think I was just really fortunate that they were very open to talking to me. I mean, the fact that I met them in that village, I think, made a big difference. You know, it's not a place where many journalists were going, and I don't know. I hope that I really managed to build up a good relationship, especially with Lida, one of the mothers, and I don't know. Maybe it helped that I've lived in Ukraine for a long time, so maybe I have a good understanding of what life's like in Ukraine. Maybe, but yeah, I think mostly I was just very fortunate. I'm very grateful to them that they were willing to put up with my endless questions and meetings with them.
Yeah, the endless question thing is always the challenge when I'm talking to people just about the innocuous things that I write about. It's like it's just eventually I can almost feel their eyes glazing over. And, oftentimes I'm talking on the phone. It's just like I'm sorry. These questions sound really inane, but like they really help with building detail. But I'm like I applaud your patience. Thank you.
Yeah, I was also really lucky with this family that they're so the way they retell their story is so vivid and so detailed. Actually, a lot of the time without me having to ask. I mean, I usually try not to direct an interview. I prefer to let people talk and tell me what they want to tell me.
Yeah.
And that way, a lot of things come up which I would never even thought about to ask. And I don't like having a preconceived idea of what the story is. It's up to them. It's their story. It's not mine. Yeah, they really had such a vivid way of retelling it, and it's actually one of the things I regret about the way I wrote it in the end is that I didn't put very many direct quotes in from the three main people, and I did that on purpose because I felt like when you're always kind of pulling the reader back, as in this person told it to me, the journalist, and there's also quite a lot of dialogue in the story which is reported from what they told me, but with other people. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
But why do you regret not putting things in quotes as much?
Because I feel like their voices were lost a bit, because the way they told their own story was so vivid, and I think maybe that a bit of that was lost in the final telling, and maybe it was the wrong decision to decide not to put in more direct quotes.
It reads beautifully, and I know Jonah said it was just like a joy to read it because it was written so well. And I think a conversation you guys might have had where I think it might have been about quotes, and you're like, well, almost just about everything is quoted from them. It's just not in quotations. It's just, you almost kind of channeled it for them, in this piece, if I'm understanding that right.
Yeah, we did have that conversation, and it's certainly what I was trying to do. Yeah, but sometimes I wonder if I kind of ironed it out, or it ended up getting ironed out a bit too much. I don't know. I mean, I'm never happy with what I write, so I would have, there would definitely be something I didn't like about it and thought I'd done wrong, and that's the main thing that I think maybe I did wrong.
Yeah, how do you work through that, not being happy with what you write? That's something that I think a lot of us wrestle with. And I wanted to just, for you, it's just how do you get it done when you're going to be infinitely displeased by everything you put down?
Yeah, I think pretty much all writers suffer from it. Good question. I don't know. Put it aside and move on to the next thing and accept that you're never going to be completely happy. A piece like this, obviously you're working with an editor as well, and so you've always got a second opinion, which helps.
Yeah. Can you ever go back and read something of your past work?
Yes. If a long enough period has gone by, I quite often if I go back, I'm often quite pleasantly surprised about actually how it's not that bad. Like the book Dreamland, I actually wrote that more than 10 years ago, and I went back to it quite recently because there's something in there that I want to refer to in my new book. And I was reading it, I was like, actually this is actually quite good. So that was nice.
The ending to me struck me as like it wasn't as clear cut, because it's very clear that the story continues, for Maxine. Just as you wrestled with the ending, what were you thinking as you were constructing this ending?
I've been working on it over 6 months. So when I first met them, as I told you, they'd only just arrived home after this gigantic journey, and I actually thought the end would be when they got the birth certificate for the baby, for David, which seemed to me sort of an ending for him. They'd made sure that he was going to live in Ukraine, and then they made sure that he was a Ukrainian citizen. And then Zhenya died, Yevgen, the volunteer who'd helped both me and Maxime and his family. And I met Maxime at his funeral, and I thought, okay, maybe that's the end. And then it was just, as I wrote, the final interview when I met Maxime and the family, and he told me that he was going to join the army. And I was like, okay, well, I guess that, as you said, I very much hope it's not the end. In a way, it is, a whole new chapter. But that seemed to me the place to stop, because it sort of makes so much sense. Why do people go to fight? There's still a war going on. In a way, this story is much happier than a lot of stories from Ukraine now, because pretty much everybody stays alive. But there is still a war going on. There is still occupation and invasion, and so for someone to choose to go and fight is sort of inevitable.
Yeah, and in talking with Jonah, he mentioned of this, this one sentence towards the end where you write, he was going to protect his family, even if that meant he had to leave them. And I think there was something of a dialogue between the two of you about how you were going to phrase that sentence and everything. So maybe you can kind of talk about that a little.
Yes, we did have a lot of discussion about that sentence. Jonah's objection to that sentence was that, of course, nobody can know what's going to happen. And going away to fight in the army, you can do it for that reason, because you want to protect your country, you want to protect your family, but what's actually going to happen is unpredictable, which I totally take his point. But I wanted something much stronger than that. It's not a decision that anybody takes lightly. And I wanted to make it clear how much determination has to go into this decision. So to say you're going to do something is much stronger than saying, you want to do something. But also for me, it does actually have two meanings. Say he's going to protect his family. You can read it as in he's going to, because as in he absolutely intends to. But it also implies in itself this going away. He's going away to protect his family. There is this horrible irony as well, that in choosing to protect his family, he's actually going to be leaving them.
Yeah, there's one sentence where you write, when there's a long, deafening roar outside that makes the windows tremble, or a series of more distant thumps, I'm the only one who flinches. And I love that in a sense, because it just shows how accustomed some people are to just the normality of shit, bombs bombs blowing up nearby or very close or far away, and it's just like, even though you've been there for several years, it's still you still flinch, but they're just they don't. You're the one who flinches, and they don't.
Yeah, it's just terrible what human beings can get used to. It's it's like the only way people can survive without going crazy, but it's also just absolutely terrible. I mean, another big discussion we had with Jonah about the end was this question about why Maxime and Lyra came back with the baby, why they didn't stay in Europe. It's also a part at the end where I asked them. And the way I'd originally written it, I'd put it more in as in, I think the reason why they came back. And then we actually changed that in the end. But this question of what people can get used to and why they can continue living in these situations, it's something which, as a journalist here, you just can't get away from. You go to these frontline villages where, there's nothing, no gas, no water, shelling every day, no work. Why are people still there? And I've just realized it's after years of going to these places that it's a completely pointless question. I mean, you just get an answer like somebody has to feed the pigs, or, where else would I go? Nobody wants me. It becomes almost an insult, I think, to even ask people. But there's all sorts of different reasons for it. But partly, I think it is, of course, that people just get used to what's happening. And you could say that about the country, that Ukraine has now pretty much got used to the fact that there's a war going on and nobody knows when it's going to end. And the world, everybody was interested in Ukraine for a while, and now they're all looking at Israel and Palestine, and soon it's going to be the next war somewhere else. And we just get used to it.
Yeah. Yeah, as someone who is right, I mean, you are there on the ground, in these villages, and what dismays you when you look outward at, say, maybe the more mainstream coverage of what you might read versus what you're experiencing and what the people around you are experiencing, like, day to day.
I mean, what really dismays me now is how everybody's forgotten about Ukraine. I mean, I understand that it's inevitable, but it's still, it's dismaying because Ukraine needs international support in this war. And if it loses it, then it's going to be a disaster. But in general, I think media coverage has been good of Ukraine. It's been really good since the invasion started. Before then, not so much. I mean, this war started in 2014, and I know that journalists who are based here, including myself, we feel like we've just been fighting this battle since 2014 to get the world to notice that there is actually a war going on, that Crimea was annexed and occupied, that East Ukraine was occupied. It wasn't a civil war, it was Russia. And so in a way it was sort of huge relief that the rest of the world woke up to this fact, at least in 2022.
Yeah, what are the nature of the conversations you have with fellow foreign correspondents there in Ukraine?
Well, we don't have many conversations these days because we're all so busy, to be honest. Well, yeah, I'd say, relief that now people know what we're talking about. We don't have to explain every time where Donbass is, where Crimea is, who the Crimean Tatars are, or whatever. But there's definitely a lot of dismay, I would say, at the moment, at just seeing this attention completely switch somewhere else. And I mean, we used to the war in East Ukraine, it started being called Europe's Forgotten War, and around 2016 that became the way to describe it. you know. And I just noticed another journalist who's based here. He did a story a couple of days ago, and he had to introduce it as something like the war the rest of the world is forgetting about. I mean, he hated it, but it was like that's there's always has to be a phrase, you know, to describe something. And
Well, I think what's good about your story also is that it coming out, now it kind of refreshes the leaves, so to speak, that this conflict, or this war, is very much ongoing, and you're really, you're showing what it's like for the people that are just living through it. It's a story that really illustrates the just that day to day, but also it's this crazy thing about the birth of these babies, which is insane on top of that. But you're really showing what it's like to live in it, and I think that'll really resonate. I don't know. I imagine that was part of your goal too. Is just like, here's the this family being put through this crucible.
yes, it was. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad. I'm glad that came across. I just really wanted to not just sort of tell the bare bones of invasion, occupation, liberation, but to convey what it's really like to live through all of this and all the sort of surreal stuff about how normal life carries on at the same time. You still dig your garden, you still try and talk to your family on the phone. In the midst of all this horror, people still get pregnant, people still have babies, and yeah, I really wanted to get that across. So glad that worked.
As a journalist, I was talking to Jonah about this, and I talk to this sometimes with other people too, about doing really intimate stories of this nature. At times it can feel, and this is just maybe me, and maybe you can speak to this, like sometimes telling these stories can feel sometimes exploitative of people, and for the benefit of the writer, the prestige of the writer, and that's always something I'm thinking about. Like, what right do I have to do this? Maybe I should just write fiction and just don't, just kind of like not tread on people's stories. And I wonder if just for you doing nonfiction and stories like this, if you ever wrestle with those kind of feelings.
Absolutely, yes, all the time. Yes, I always try to make it clear that people understand that I'm a journalist and I want to write this story. And I try to, as I said before, not to force a shape on the story, to let the people tell me what they want to tell me. And I very, very much hope that I didn't traumatize them too much in sort of asking them to go through the very difficult things that happen to them. But yeah, it's an issue for sure.
Yeah, because when you're thinking about it, it's like, in reading, true crime or anything, or just a harrowing story, and you realize that, as the writer, when you're able to metabolize that information and then, use those devices of, I don't know, of things to keep people reading, which is, some cliffhangery type things, a little bit of suspense. And you realize you're using these literary devices overlaid over like real people's trauma and real people's experiences. I'm like, oh my God, I feel really icky, trying to like, I don't know, tell the story in a way that makes the reader want to keep scrolling or turn the page. But I'm like, at the end, I'm like, oh, this is still real people, and I feel like I'm using them, and I don't know, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, I think some of that goes back to that question you asked about whether it's fiction or non-fiction. In a way, fiction feels more ethical, but in a way, it feels even less ethical when you're writing fiction about real events. Because then you're really like employing all of these devices, to talk about some war or Holocaust or whatever. There's this. I've been reading Czesław Miłosz, Polish writer and poet, and he writes something about this, about how it's immoral to write fiction about something like, well, he's talking specifically about the occupation of Warsaw, because you're trying to make something beautiful and formed and like artificial out of such horrific events. In a way, like to have something which is badly written but true is a more ethical approach. But on the other hand, would anybody read it if it was badly written? So I don't know.
Yeah. God damn. Lily, why do we do this?
Well, because it's interesting. And it's, I don't know. I mean, when I was young and naive and went into journalism, I had this strange idea that it would, change the world, which clearly isn't true. But I think you do get seized by a story, right? You get seized by something which feels to you so amazing and actually important that it's. I mean, like this family, the story of the family from the Atavist story. Before I even knew that I was going to try and write it up somewhere, I just told everybody about it because I just thought it was such an amazing story. And that's what people do, right? Even if they're not writers, they still tell stories all the time. They tell each other stories.
Well, Lily, I want to be mindful of your time. You're at the end of your day. I'm at the start of mine, so I want to let you be able to power down as best you can. As I like to bring these conversations down for a landing, I always ask the guest for a recommendation of some kind, and that can just be anything for the listeners out there. Something that you're excited about that you think that maybe you can enrich someone's life with something that you're enjoying, be it a book or a brand of socks or a brand of coffee. It's totally up to you, Lily.
Well, I mentioned I've been reading Czesław Miłosz, and I would really recommend this book, The Captive Mind, which it's about writers and totalitarianism. Specifically, it's about writers living under the Soviet regime in Poland after World War II. But it's where the comment I mentioned comes from, the one about whether it's not immoral to write fiction about horrific historical events. But I'm finding it really fascinating, and also a real kind of lesson in how to write narrative nonfiction, some of it. So I would really, really recommend The Captive Mind, Czesław Miłosz.
Fantastic. Well, Lily, I'm so glad that you went down the writer path, became a journalist, and so we could read the amazing stuff you're coming up with, especially with this piece that you did for the Atavist. It's an incredible piece. So I just thank you so much for the work you're doing and for coming on the pod.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was great to talk.
All right. Thank you very much, CNFers, for making it this far. Thank you to Jonah and Lily for the time. I don't have a parting shot today because, who cares, really? It doesn't matter. Nothing I say matters. We're all just molecules, man. My goal for heading into this week was to be more positive because I have a tendency to shoot myself in the foot and be my own worst enemy. And it made me more negative. Then I thought about this moment in The Last Dance on Michael Jordan where someone brings up something like a negative thing, and he's like, why focus on that? Why focus on that? Let's focus on the positive. And I'm like, how do you do that when life is meaningless and we're all going to die anyway? So stay wild, CNFers. And if you can't do, interview. See ya.